Our fourth point is purity. Purity here refers to the purity of the individual. So in the case of our sisters, purity from menstruation, for example. Our sisters must be pure before the fasting starts. For our sisters who are menstruating, for example, they are not required to fast, but they are required to make up that fasting later on. However, if the individual fasts while they are impure, that fasting is not correct. That fasting is negated. It does not have ground. It's incorrect. Number 5 is that the fasting, and this is a very important point, and this point is always misunderstood in our West. Fasting does not cause harm to the individual. If fasting causes harm to the individual, so if some of our brothers and our sisters are diabetic, or they have a specific ailment or specific illness, where fasting causes them harm. Now, this is not just any harm. So I'm not saying, oh, well, technically being hungry is a form of harm, or my stomach is in pain because I'm fasting. That's not the type of harm we're talking about. We're talking about legitimate harm. So if fasting causes illness or causes a severity to that illness, or causes that illness to be prolonged, then it is not an obligation upon that individual. So it says does not cause harm. It is not obligated upon the individual to fast if that fasting causes harm, such as if the fasting causes the individual to become even more sick, as we mentioned, or it would delay the recovery or cause pain. Again, all of this is under the consideration of what normally is accepted and is not accepted. Our sixth point is that the individual must be present. Present meaning that he must not be traveling and she must not be traveling. And travel is something that we'll have to touch upon to clarify certain issues. So it is not obligated upon the individual who was traveling to fast if that traveling is beyond the specific distance that is put forth by the jurisprudence in Islam. That specific distance is 44 kilometers one way, or 22 kilometers going and coming back, or like one way and the other is 22 kilometers each, so that the total sum adds up to 44 kilometers. That fasting is considered, if the individual fasts while they're traveling, that fasting is incorrect, and that they would have to make it up on a later occasion, on a later date. However, there are exceptions to that rule. Our first exception, we'll call it A, exception number A, is that the individual is not ignorant of that rule. So if an individual is ignorant of that rule, travels fasting thinking that it's permissible, then and then finds out, let's say a day or two after, he tells his friend, he tells his father, oh, I traveled and I was fasting. If he finds out after the incident, then the fasting is accepted and does not have to make it up later. However, if he knows beforehand, then he is not allowed to fast. It's no longer obligated on him. In fact, the obligation goes in the opposite way now. It is an obligation on him not to fast if he traveled before noon. If he traveled after noon, however, he must continue fasting, and we'll touch upon that later on, inshallah. Point number B, or the third exception, is the individual who leaves traveling after the noon hour. So I am set to travel. I know that I'm going to travel from point A to point B, from one city to the other. However, I'm traveling after noon. So after the noon hour is when I am traveling, and it's during the month of Ramadan. Because it has come after the noon hour, then the individual does not have to break his fasting. In fact, as an obligatory precaution, or as a precaution, the individual must continue with their fasting. And just to clarify one more time, if the individual is traveling before that hour, so if the individual travels between the time between the time of fasting at dawn, so from dawn to the noon hour, then they must break their fast if they're traveling. However, if they travel after that hour, after the noon hour, then they must continue with their fasting. And our third point is, our third exception, is that the individual who returns from his travel before noon and has not taken any or done anything that negates the fasting, as a precaution, the individual should make intention of fasting and to do so. What is this telling us? This is telling us that, for example, I decided to travel from point A to point B at 6:30, and the fasting dawn starts at 5 o'clock. At 6:30, I left my house, and my intention is to travel. I went to I went the full distance, the 44 kilometers or the 22 kilometers, either way. I did whatever I needed to do over there, then I came back. When I came back, let's say noon hour is at 12 o'clock, or it's at 12:30, for example. I came back at 10 o'clock, or I came back at 11 o'clock. I came back to my home at 11 o'clock, to what I refer to as my hometown, at 11 o'clock. The law says here, the ruling says here, the jurisprudence ruling here says that if I have not consumed anything or done or have taken an action that negates fasting, meaning that, for example, I did not drink or I did not eat during that time, and I returned to my home before noon hour, before the midday, the noon hour, then I am allowed to begin my fasting. I am allowed to fast that day. So at that point, I set my intention to say, you know what, I am going to fast this day of Ramadan out of submission for God. Of course, I don't have to say it verbally. It's just the idea of knowing the action that I'm about to take. I am going to fast this day, and I begin my fasting and I continue it. But if consumed water, for example, so while I'm traveling, as we said, between 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock, during that time I drank a cup of water, or not even drank a cup of water, I simply consumed anything which would negate my fasting in regular cases, then that whole day, even if I return before the noon hour, that whole day is written off. That whole day does no longer counts, and I cannot fast that day. I have to make it up another day. Also, there's certain points. An individual who travels before noon is not permitted to break his or her fast before leaving the borders. The borders that are considered the authorized borders where the individual is traveling. As we said, the authorized borders where the individual is considered traveling is 44 kilometers one way. So if I'm traveling in one direction, it's 44 kilometers, or it's 22 kilometers one way and back, and the other way back. Inshallah, in our next episode, we'll touch upon the concept of travel, the rules of traveling, what refers to our fasting, and what can we understand from that, and how can we implement that in the West and here as well. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.